Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to say a few words about interpreting as a career. And the first thing you have to sort out is that interpreters are not translators. What I mean by that is that a translator reads and writes, whereas an interpreter listens and speaks. So a translator will receive a document, read it through, type up a translation. It's very good if you need a precise translation, perhaps a legal contract. Every word must be correct. But it takes a long time. What an interpreter does is immediately tell you what the other person is saying. That means, of course, it's very good for meetings, conferences, where you don't want to wait 3 days to read a translation. It does mean, though, that the interpreter can never be quite as precise as a translator. And in fact, that's part of the fun of interpreting. It's very creative. You often find that you have to reconstruct what the speaker is saying. You don't go through word by word. You might find yourself telling their story or making their argument in a completely different way, using different sentences and different words to make the same point. You might also sometimes find yourself adding some cultural information. The speaker might say something which everyone understands in their culture, but for your listeners to understand, you might quickly have to add a couple of cultural points. Basically, there are two main kinds of interpretation: consecutive and simultaneous. Simultaneous interpretation is what you can see people doing here in the rooms behind me. While I'm speaking, they are immediately interpreting my ideas so that someone else can listen straight away. It's very good for a meeting or a conference. Consecutive is what you do if you haven't got all this technology. You're perhaps walking around a farm, or you're just meeting in a small room somewhere. The speaker speaks for a few minutes, and the interpreter takes notes, and then the speaker stops, and the interpreter gives an interpretation of what they said. And then the speaker starts again, and so on. The problem with consecutive interpretation, of course, is that it's much slower. So most people prefer to use simultaneous interpreters when they've got the technology to do it. So what kind of person wants to be an interpreter? Well, it's people who like the stress, the excitement of interpreting. It's you there. You're in the hot seat. You have got to understand what the other person is saying and interpret it straight away. It's very different from translation. Translator, you get a document in, you've got time to look up the vocabulary or to think of just the right word, the perfect word to translate the word in the original. Translation appeals to people who are thorough, who like to be careful. Although it's important to remember that translators very often have to work under time pressure as well. Interpreting appeals much more to people who enjoy the adrenaline of having to get it right now without waiting. Some people find that rather frustrating. A translator, at the end of the day, has a nice document. They've checked it through, they've done it well, it's perfect, they can send it off to their customer. An interpreter, at the end of the day, has nothing. The conference is finished, you go home. I personally like that. I don't take my work home. But some people find it frustrating. Another aspect of interpreting is that we tend to travel a lot. Meetings don't take place outside your house. You might find yourself traveling all around Europe or all around the world. Well, some people love that. Other people don't. But you're not going to escape it if you're an interpreter. Probably the best thing about interpreting is what I just said. It's exciting, it's creative. There's lots of adrenaline, lots of enjoyable pressure on you. Another advantage is, quite often you'll be going to interesting conferences, very varied conferences, meeting lots of people. You might meet all kinds of VIPs who you otherwise only see on television. Or you might find yourself going around a farm, or going around a factory, places that you would never have seen if you weren't an interpreter. You might find yourself in some big castle somewhere, or going to a fancy dinner where you will be eating the same fancy food as the delegates, which is a nice advantage.